Wild Cumberland is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and all donations are tax deductible. Learn more and take action at wildcumberland.org.
Managers are to be guardians, not gardeners. If there's anything that needs managing in wilderness, it's us. It's the people.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Jessica, Executive Director of Wild Cumberland. We appreciate you being here. Our goal in special podcast episodes like this one is to dig deeper into the topics related to the seashore and, most importantly, its wilderness. Today, we are honored to do just that with George Nickas, the Executive Director of Wilderness Watch. Wilderness Watch was founded in 1989, and it is a national organization whose focus is on the preservation and stewardship of lands within our National Wilderness Preservation System. This organization grew out of concern that there was a whole lot of emphasis on adding new areas to our system, but conditions of our existing wilderness areas were largely ignored. Wilderness Watch believes, just like we do, that the preservation of wilderness depends on the commitment of informed citizens. And that's why they encourage things like citizen oversight, public education, and, when necessary, legal and legislative action in order to protect wilderness. So with that being said, George, thank you for being here and being willing to spend some time in conversation with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. I really look forward to having this conversation.
We hope you've been enjoying the Wild Cumberland podcast, where you can stay up to date on everything affecting Cumberland Island and its wilderness. If you value our mission and purpose, we ask that you share this episode with at least one friend. This simple act helps us grow our audience and improve our messaging for the organization. We thank you for your support, and before you go, be sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss an episode.
George, you have been on staff with Wilderness Watch since 1996. I'm willing to bet some of our listeners hadn't even been born then.
I hope not.
Right? If we're doing our jobs right. But your organization has a history of engaging to protect Cumberland Island's wilderness specifically since it began. And we'll get into that history a little bit in our discussion. But first, I think it might be helpful for you to share with our listeners a little bit about what Wilderness Watch does on a day-to-day basis.
Well, sure. And I think you did a pretty good job of describing what our mission is, and that is to try to act as citizen watchdogs, if you will, to make sure that the lands and the waters in the National Wilderness Preservation System are managed to preserve their wilderness values for now and forever. And so we engage with the federal agencies a lot whenever a project is proposed in wilderness, and we learn about it. And sometimes we're told, and sometimes we have to find out about it in other ways. But when we learn about it, we engage with the agencies and we look at the project and we see if it's in compliance with the Wilderness Act, first of all, agency policies, and whether or not it's actually going to be good or harmful for the wilderness. And we'll provide public comments. We'll notify our members. We're a membership organization, have members all over the country. We notify our supporters, people who follow us on social media, people who get our action alerts, and give them all an opportunity to weigh in. Because as you said, it's just essential that citizens participate in these processes and let their feelings be known. So we'll engage in that way, and we will, as you mentioned, sometimes if the agencies decide they're going to do something that we think is unlawful, we'll challenge those decisions in court, and so we get involved in that way as well, and have built, I think, a pretty strong body of case law to defend wilderness around the country. And one of the most important of those happened right there at Cumberland Island, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little more. And then we also engage with Congress, and we don't really push wilderness bills to get new areas designated. There's lots of people who do that kind of work, but we try to make sure that whatever legislation Congress is dealing with that affects wilderness won't harm existing wildernesses or won't harm the Wilderness Act, or we just get involved in as many levels as we can at trying to make sure that these wilderness lands are preserved forever.
That's a really important role that you just described there, George. And let me ask, we talk a lot about, we meaning advocates, I guess, environmentalists, conservationists, I suppose, use terms like citizen oversight and public engagement regularly in our work. But what does that mean, or how does Wilderness Watch define those terms, or what does that mean to the average person, I guess?
Well, in the broadest sense, I think it means anything that a citizen does to try to protect a place, preserve a place, whatever that might be. That's certainly citizen engagement. The kind of things that we often get involved in are, as I was describing, have to do with the formal public comment, public involvement processes that the federal agencies have established for citizens to engage on these things. And, I say that recognizing that, unfortunately, oftentimes these processes are set up in a way that makes it maybe a little bit more difficult for citizens, or that the process is designed to lead people to support whatever it is the agency is proposing. And so you don't want to limit your activism to solely the processes that the agencies have offered up. People can write letters to the editor if they're concerned about something. That's a very, very, very important thing. It's one of the most important things you can do. I often say, if you write a letter to the agency, a couple people in the agency will read it. If you write a letter to the editor, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people might read it. So that's a very important way. Show up at a public meeting, a public process. Go to the office of one of the land management agencies that oversee wilderness, and set up a meeting and meet with the people who are in charge and tell them what you think. There's lots of different ways that people can get involved. As an organization that encourages citizen involvement, we try to make it as easy as we can. We try to give people the information they need so that they can be informed and effective advocates. But I'll tell you, it's whatever you find. Who would have ever thought the way to draw the most attention to the climate crisis would be for a 16-year-old girl to go on strike on Fridays and stand out in front of the parliament or the school or whatever, and try to draw attention to the climate crisis. So, if you're creative, you can probably find lots of better ideas than I have as to how you can be involved in trying to protect these wildlands. The important thing is to just get involved at some level so that we can have an impact.
Yeah, I think, our volunteers take pretty seriously their role in helping to make sure that people are informed to make the best decisions that they can, and understand that not everybody's equipped for every level of advocacy.
Right.
But you touched on something important, which I think is sometimes the difficulty of navigating these systems, these public comment periods, which are now primarily, online. And especially since COVID, there are fewer and fewer opportunities, I think, for the public to have consistent, face-to-face interaction with the agencies that are managing our land. So, that's one thing I think I consider one of our biggest challenges. But in your world, and because you do this work on a national, sort of scale, what do you consider the biggest challenge to wilderness advocacy right now?
If you're asking about what the biggest challenge is to preserving wilderness, that's one thing. If you're asking about what's the biggest challenge to getting people engaged, that's another question.
Now you got to answer both.
Okay, so I'll take the latter one first, since that's what we've sort of been focusing on. And that is, I think people are very distracted. There's a lot going on. There are a lot of issues, pulling at people's attention, whether they're environmental issues, they're social issues, they're economic issues, et cetera, issues of war. All of these things are getting people's attention. And I also think that the we're very distracted by the internet and all the social media and all the 24-hour news and all these other technological gadgets that we all have that really get us distracted and unfocused and pulled in a million directions. And so it's a challenge to get people's attention. It's a challenge to get them to focus on things that really matter. And I think that's one of the great things as wilderness advocates is, if people get out into the wilderness, or it doesn't have to be a designated wilderness, it can be any wild place or any quiet place, and have a chance to unplug from all of that, which I strongly encourage everybody out there to do. Unplug when you go to these areas and have a chance to just, listen to your own thoughts, listen to your own head, and just absorb nature, absorb these places. And it can help you to refocus and come out and be a stronger and better advocate for them. So I think that's one of the things. As for what's the biggest challenge for wilderness, I think it's the same thing that it has always been. It's the same thing that the people who pushed to get the wilderness bill passed 60 years ago. This is the 60th anniversary of the Wilderness Act this year. And that challenge is that human beings, especially in this country, but around the world, have a hard time practicing restraint. And wilderness is about restraint. It was a decision we made, and it was really the first time, certainly in our country, but maybe anywhere in the world, that a law was passed that said, we're just going to leave some places alone. We're going to leave them to nature. We're going to step back and let nature do its thing, and we're going to have the opportunity to visit these places, to experience them, to learn from them. But we're just going to let nature be. We're going to let the critters be. It's their home. It's their place. We're going to step back and do that. That was a really hard idea for a nation that was built on manifest destiny and conquering nature to accept. But eventually, the advocates of the wilderness idea, and not just the founders, but all the citizens out there who reached out to their congressmen and congresswomen and their local editors and everybody else and pushed for this wilderness idea, they succeeded. And Congress said, okay, this is a great idea. We're going to do that. And so we got the National Wilderness Preservation System as a result. But just because the law passed doesn't mean that all of those other folks who don't really necessarily believe in that idea or in restraint went away. They're still out there. I've often heard it, drawn a similarity between the Civil Rights Act. We passed the Civil Rights Act and we didn't wake up the next day and everybody had the same freedoms and the same opportunities and the same rights and everything else. It's a constant struggle. And so it is with wilderness. And so today we face those same problems. All the federal agencies that oversee our public lands, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, they all opposed the wilderness bill when it was in Congress. They didn't like that Congress was going to take away their ability to do whatever they wanted to do with these lands. They wanted to have discretion to manage them however they saw fit. And Congress said, no, you can't in these places. All of those agencies continue to work day in and day out to try to gain back some of that discretion they lost. And that's why we wind up in court oftentimes, because they're doing things that the law said they couldn't do and shouldn't do in these places. And so the agencies have a hard time with restraint, but a lot of citizen groups too. And nowadays, with the massive boom in recreation use that is occurring, there's a lot of recreation groups that also want to carve up the Wilderness Act so that they can have special exceptions for their use. Now, they want everybody else's use to be restricted, but not their use to be restricted. And so it's the same issue that plays out in different ways. And it's this idea of whether or not we as a people, as a society, are willing to have some restraint and show some humility and allow nature to be in some places. And the founders of the wilderness idea had the hope, had the aspiration that by setting aside these areas and preserving them, and for people to learn to enjoy them and understand them and accept them, we might just treat the rest of nature a little better everywhere else too. And so that was really the ideals behind the Wilderness Act, and it's still the ideal behind the act, and it's still the greatest challenge.
Yeah, I think that context is really important for people to remember. And you mentioned something or alluded to something that I was going to ask you about later. And I really do want to take people back to Cumberland Island. But I think it's important for people to realize and understand that there is a difference in how each agency within the Department of Interior manages these lands. You sort of hinted at that a minute ago, right? There's Forest Service, there's BLM, there's Fish and Wildlife, there's National Park Service, and they have different degrees of sort of requirements and policies that affect the way that all of these lands are managed. And I'm not sure, I think, especially in the Southeast, we have so few wilderness areas, and people think that if they've experienced a Forest Service managed area, they know what all wilderness areas are like. But in truth, each agency manages them very differently, right?
Well, they all have their own biases and their own challenges and problems. They're all bound by the same Wilderness Act, and it applies to all of the agencies equally. How they implement it in their policies, that's where the differences come out, but also in their cultures. The Forest Service had a long history of sort of wilderness management, if you will, because before there was a Wilderness Act in '64, the Forest Service had been setting aside what it called wild areas and wilderness areas and primitive areas, starting in 1924 with Aldo Leopold down on the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, celebrating the 100th anniversary of that this year, by the way.
Wow. Wow.
The Forest Service had quite a bit of experience with this idea of wilderness. It wasn't quite as restrictive as the Wilderness Act, and they could undo their own administrative wilderness designations at any time. And so that's part of what motivated citizen groups to say we need a law in order to make sure that once areas get set aside by Congress, they'll be preserved forever. So the Forest Service had quite a long history and kind of moved into wilderness management pretty easily. The Park Service, since we are talking about Cumberland Island, has always resisted the Wilderness Act. It has always resisted wilderness designation. It feels like, well, we have these backcountry areas, we have undeveloped areas in the park. We don't need this overlay of wilderness designation on them. So the Park Service has probably been, in my mind, the most resistant, the most recalcitrant in living up to the mandates of the Wilderness Act. They say, well, we're going to follow our Organic Act, which dates back to the origins of the National Park Service. But the Organic Act doesn't talk about wilderness, and it's not that specific about how the parks will be managed. It leaves how they'll be managed entirely up to the Park Service. But the Wilderness Act came in and Congress said, yeah, it's still a national park. It's still subject to those rules, but it also is now subject to the Wilderness Act, and you have to adhere to the Wilderness Act. And I think Cumberland Island is probably a classic example of where the Park Service never did accept this idea of wilderness and the constraints put on it by the Wilderness Act, and really never has, and to this day still doesn't.
Wild Cumberland is staffed entirely by volunteers. We say that a lot, often in passing, but we want to make sure our listeners understand what that really means. Our team members donate their time, effort, and talents to help ensure that Cumberland Island and its wilderness remain protected. Every volunteer can find a place with us. We invite you to sign up to staff Wild Cumberland events, contribute to the organization's social media, assist in grant writing, and much more. Join us at wildcumberland.org and help make a difference for the next generation.
George, you've been doing this work a long time. Take us back and tell us from a 5,000-foot perspective, sort of what has transpired in Cumberland Island's wilderness management history?
Sure, and you really, I think you have to go back to probably the 1960s, maybe late 50s, but 1960s, when some visionary folks in government and outside of government grew very concerned that our shorelines on both the eastern shore and the western shore were getting developed. And if we didn't set aside some areas, some of the few remaining undeveloped areas, there wouldn't be any left. And so they started looking for places where we could establish these national seashores. And Cumberland Island was one of those. And, Cumberland is, as I'm sure your listeners are aware, the largest undeveloped barrier island off the eastern seaboard. And so they started looking at it. And at that time, Cumberland was mostly privately owned. And so Congress authorized acquiring private lands in places like Cumberland in order to create these national seashores. And then at the same time, there were development threats on Cumberland. One of the Carnegie family, which owned much of Cumberland, one of the families sold their inheritance to a guy named Charles Fraser, who developed Hilton Head and other places. And he wanted to do massive development on Cumberland, and that scared the hell out of a lot of people. And so Cumberland was acquired, and for the most part, all of the people who had private land sold those private lands, many to the federal government, so that the seashore could be established, and they retained rights to continue to occupy their properties for a certain amount of time. And there's some of those retained rights are still exist, and that's why you find some of the private homes on the public lands on Cumberland today. But in 1972, after most of the land acquisitions had occurred, Congress passed the Cumberland Island National Seashore Act, which established the Cumberland Island National Seashore. And the intent in that law was that for basically the northern 2/3 of the island, that was the wildest part, the most undeveloped part of the island. And the goal was over time, that area would be reclaimed by nature as the private rights expired and the private interests left, that the northern 2/3 of the island would essentially become wilderness. And it didn't designate wilderness then, but that was the whole idea. And you read through the legislative history, and it's very interesting because you even have congressmen like Congressman Don Young of Alaska, who was known as a sort of an anti-environmentalist and challenging wilderness all the time. But even Don Young saying things like, this is a great opportunity to watch nature in action and to actually restore a place of wild America that will be unique to the whole country. And Cumberland Island is, of course, a very unique place to the whole country. And so that was always the goal. And then in 1982, Congress passed the Cumberland Island Wilderness Bill, and it designated most of those lands on the northern 2/3 of the seashore as wilderness or potential wilderness. Wherever there were still private rights that prevented those areas from being designated wilderness, they were designated as potential wilderness to become wilderness once the private rights issues expired. And some of those are because of state lands in the marshes, and some of it were these private inholdings. So back in the early 60s, when Stuart Udall was Secretary of Interior, and they were pushing this idea of these national seashores all the way up through the 80s and beyond, the goal was the restoration of the northern 2/3 of that island as a wild place. So that's kind of how the Cumberland Island wilderness came to be. Now, another thing that was going on at that time that is very relevant to today is there was a lot of concern, even amongst the people who retained those private rights or still had private land on the island, that the island was going to get overrun because there was a proposal to build a causeway over to it, and you would start having a lot of people. And wilderness designation was attractive to even a lot of the private landowners at that time because they saw it as a way to restrict the numbers of people, and so they wouldn't get overrun in their own little private enclaves. It had a lot of value for the wildlife too. I'm not saying it was ever a bad idea. I think it was a great idea to restrict the numbers, but they restricted the numbers to 300 people a day. And the only way basically for most people to get there is on the ferry. And so that has served to help protect the island. Today, there are a lot of proposals, and the Park Service is wanting to expand access to the island in a variety of ways, and I think that's one of the real risks to it.
But, there's a piece of this, I think, that we also need to explain, which is that our wilderness boundaries on Cumberland Island, and in fact, a large portion of wilderness designation was actually removed after that 1982 designation.
That's right. And that's, I guess, the next stage of the story, if you will. The Park Service, even after the island was designated wilderness, the Park Service was still driving around through the wilderness as though it had never been designated. And for people who may not know the details of the Wilderness Act or what wilderness means, one of the things that it does is it prohibits motor vehicles and mechanical transport and structures. And, a lot of these things that we relate to modern settlement and society and development are prohibited so that it's more of a natural, remote, primitive place. Mm-hmm. And the Park Service, was driving through the wilderness routinely and even hauling visitors to go look at historic sites. And so eventually, we challenged that. That's when I first got involved in Cumberland Island in the late 1990s. We challenged that. We went to court, and the court said that the Park Service was violating the law and they needed to stop these tours. And some of the people on the island, I guess, maybe saw the writing on the wall or became concerned that, oh my God, if they start managing this as wilderness, we're going to have to start limiting our driving too. We're going to have to start limiting what we do. And they were politically connected people, had friends in high places in Congress, and so they went to Congress and convinced Congressman Jack Kingston, who represented that area in Georgia, and Senator Saxby Chambliss to push legislation that essentially it was described as Cumberland Island was drawn and quartered. They carved out these corridors through the wilderness where motor vehicles could drive, and they wiped out some of this potential wilderness, lands that would eventually become wilderness on the island, and they took them out of the potential wilderness category. It's not so much the amount of acreage that was lost that did so much harm to Cumberland, but it really fragmented and minimized the wilderness that is still there. You can't get very far from a road or where motor vehicles travel on Cumberland like you could before they did this. And so that's something that I really think people who care about Cumberland, conservationists and activists, really need to work to try to undo. Cumberland still has the potential to become one of the most incredible, unique, wild places. There's nowhere else in the wilderness system that has a beach like Cumberland Islands.
No,
and
there's
then
really
the
not.
dunes and all the live oaks with the Spanish moss, and then all the wetlands, the marshlands on the west side of the island. And because it's an island, it's removed from so much of the development and civilization that's on the mainland. It's just such a spectacular place, and we still have a chance to reclaim that. But it will take a lot of citizen activism to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first encountered Cumberland Island, it was before that boundary change, and those before vehicles were and tours were going up and down the island on a recurring basis. And it was a very different place then. And I think the shifting baseline that we have is important to remember when we look at places like Cumberland in particular, because as time passes, we forget what the intent was in creating them, we're so caught up in enjoying and or managing and or maximizing the benefit they can provide to people. But wilderness is, I mean, there are human benefits to wilderness, but wilderness, as a designation is actually, I feel, and most of our supporters feel, a much bigger designation than that. And it's meant to be more inclusive than just meeting our species needs. And it's interesting when we talk about, you talked about quartered and diced it, or, quartered and divided the island. It's funny to me because there's so much buzz around like landscape scale conservation, right? And wildlife corridors and ecosystem scale protection. Like, these are all buzzwords we're hearing on all of the funding initiatives and all of the things that are floating about politically right now, under 30 by 30 and other initiatives. But wilderness to me has always been sort of the OG, right? Like it's the epitome of that. It's the original version of that. It's what we knew. It was our language for that at the time. Is that an incorrect assessment?
No, I think it's absolutely right. It was, wilderness is that the gold standard for land protection, for protecting wildlife and all. National parks also, do a lot to protect wildlife, but it's really the gold standard of land protection, and it provides all those habitat needs, and especially for species that are often called wilderness dependent. They're not wilderness dependent because that's the only place their food grows, for example, but they're wilderness dependent because they just don't do well in places that have a lot of human activity. And that's a great thing about wilderness is it's their home, it's their place, and it's such a wonderful statement on behalf of a society to say we're going to leave some places alone for those other species, for those other critters. But
we've got our fingers in everything, right? We're restoring everything. We are revitalizing everything. I mean, it's almost like the equivalent of a scientific control,
It is. Well, it is. It absolutely is a scientific control. But wilderness itself is not safe from that very same meddling that has caused so much harm everywhere else. Managers are constantly wanting to go in and manipulate these wildernesses to look like what they want them to look like. It's the manager's desired conditions, not nature's desired conditions. So they're still fighting nature, even in these wildernesses, and it's happening on Cumberland with the way they manage fire, for example. They suppress natural fires that ignite, and then they go in there and light manager ignited fires where they want them to burn, when they want them to burn, how they want them to burn. There's nothing natural about that. And so this propensity that this management paradigm, and I went through forestry school. I get the management paradigm, and I've been doing this a long time. The management paradigm is alive and well in these places. And they've forgotten that the role of wilderness managers, as the founder of the author of the Wilderness Act and the chief lobbyist to get it passed, used to say, managers are to be guardians, not gardeners. And they want to be gardeners and rather than guardians. If there's anything that needs managing in wilderness, it's us. It's the people. It's the managers that need to be managed. It's the visitors that need to be managed. And I don't mean that in a direct control way, because one of the great things about wilderness recreation is the freedom that goes along with that. But responsibility is part of freedom. And so it's that propensity to manage everything exists in wilderness, and it's quite a challenge.
Yeah, you raised some good points. And, when you look at what Cumberland Island features, being one of the largest, I think, remaining maritime forests on the entire, coast, much like it's the largest barrier island, the detriment that they could do without, intending to is irreversible. And again, it goes back to where we began with this, which is the idea of restraint and our sense of time, and how, I often feel even many of the initiatives, people attempt to justify them, especially with climate change, with a sense of urgency. But really, our sense of time as a species is very limited in scope. And I think that's what wilderness has really offered me, is a different perspective on just those two things, restraint and time. And I think those things offer me a great deal of peace that I wish more people could understand. So I think these conversations are really helpful, and I hope that it offers some perspective, I guess, and hearing from you as a national advocate and doing this work with multiple agencies, I think it probably is very validating for especially some of our audience to hear that these are issues that are, while they're specific to Cumberland, are maybe happening across other parts of our country. Now, George, you made the mistake before this conversation telling me that I could ask you anything. And so I want to ask you what may be a controversial question. Does Wilderness Watch have or take a position on the island's feral horse population? Because as you may know, this has been, there's been some litigative action here. This has been a tourist draw for Cumberland Island for decades and decades. As you've just discussed, our wilderness there, and well, we didn't say this earlier, but our wilderness has never had a wilderness management plan, right? And it's this very unique, valuable ecosystem that has, I guess, importance for the state of Georgia, for our country, for global species. So I'm curious to know, where does Wilderness Watch stand on that issue, if you'll share?
Well, yeah, no. We're concerned about the wild horses and the impacts they're having on much of the island, and in the past have urged the Park Service to the extent that it wants to have horses on the island, they should confine them to the southern part of the island where the majority of visitors are, and where, if they want to tell maybe the historic story of wild horses on the island, they can do so. But they do a lot of ecological damage. They're an introduced species. They're really not even, it's not even like an introduced wildlife species in that regard, which is not a good thing in wilderness, don't get me wrong. But they are, feral horses. And it's, the horses aren't even doing very well on much of the island. And that's one of the tragedies. When I've hiked around, I've seen a lot of the horses, and I grew up with horses and raised horses, and they're not healthy. A lot of them, they're thin. Their hooves look like hell. It's just not all that humane for the horses. And so we would like them to find a very humane way to find another home that is better suited to horses, and better suited to the environment than what Cumberland Island is.
Yeah, I think what's most disappointing to me personally even is that the agency just doesn't do anything, right? And that they could take the initiative to do something for both the protection of these fragile ecosystems and for the health of these animals. And so whether there's a legal imperative to do it or a policy directive, it really doesn't matter to me. It's more of a moral imperative, right?
I agree. Yeah.
I hate to see that so many taxpayer dollars and individuals have to drag the government into court just to force them to do what's morally right. And I guess that is always my position on the issue. And I think I'm really grateful that somebody's attempting to do something about it. I'm enamored that the horses themselves are involved and named parties in the suit, and I think that's appropriate. So
Yeah.
I am eager. It's springtime on the seashore. There are lots of foals being born. but I've seen how very short their lives can be, and how tragic and difficult they can be there. So I appreciate that you're willing to share, your perspective and thoughts on that. You've spent a lot of time there over the years. I would love to be able to get you back down there again sometime soon. But I value your perspective and understanding of the place so much. And I think sometimes that's our challenge, if I'm honest. And I've said this to my volunteers before, which is that Cumberland Island is sort of a bucket list kind of place, right? So people come once, they may never go back. They're on to the next great, beautiful place in America. And it's only when you return to a place over and over and you have this more intimate understanding and this repeated exposure that you really begin to be able to take in everything that it has to offer you. And that's when you can sort of peel back the layer and say, oh, these horses galloping down the beach, which at first seems so romantic and lovely. Yeah, they're covered in open, gaping sores and their rib bones stick out. And that's not how horses are supposed to be.
Yeah. I think we're culturally inclined to love horses. I do, and part
of the American narrative, I think.
Them. Yeah, and but at the same time, there are a lot of humane ways to there's ways that are being experimented with in a lot of places to control breeding and all of those things to reduce populations, and there are answers that are both right by the horses and right by the island, and they need to do something about it. And you're right; it's a moral question, and they're not the agency is not rising to the task.
Right. Well, let me ask before we close out and before I let you get back to your responsibilities there, what do you think the Wilderness Act could be improved? Is it fundamental? I mean, that sounds like such a broad question, but you've litigated on behalf of this before, countless times. Your organization has. You've been involved in every aspect of our country that essentially, touches the Wilderness Act. Are there ways that it could be improved that would benefit society? Is it something we're all missing? Is there a piece we're missing?
Well, if you gave me the power to amend the Wilderness Act, there are lots of changes I would make, because there were a lot of compromises made when that law was passed. But the broader, the kind of the broader answer I have to that is no. The Wilderness Act doesn't need to be amended. The Wilderness Act set forth an ideal, and that ideal is very apparent in the law. It's very apparent in the legislative history of the law, and the ideal is spot on. Now, whether or not the compromises in the bill or the language in the bill exactly gets us to that ideal, probably not. And so it could be strengthened. It allowed some existing activities to continue, like livestock grazing, which is having a huge impact on a lot of wildernesses out in the West. It allowed, it had some other exceptions for other things in there. One of which is fire control, some things like that. But if even those things are implemented in a way that is respectful and of wilderness and the ideal of wilderness, then the statute is still living up to its ideal. And so the Wilderness Act is unique in a lot of ways, aside from what it did. I mean, the law's written almost like poetry, compared to statutes. If you've read laws and then you pick up the Wilderness Act, you go, wow, this is a law, where a place where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. You don't find language like that in statute, but it's a very unique law. It doesn't need changing. It could be improved without question. I think the biggest problem is and Leopold said it, and I can't quite quote him, but it's still about, building a sense of humility and respect and love in the human heart, so that we can allow these places to persist forever. And that's really what it's about. And it's all there in the law. It just requires those who are responsible for implementing the law, the land managers, and those of us as citizens who love these places, to live up to the ideal. And if we live up to the ideal, the law is just fine.
George, thank you so much for sharing your incredible history and experience with us. We are so honored that you took the time to do so. We're all, I know, very grateful for the work you and your organization have done to protect Cumberland Island, its wilderness, and all of the species who depend on it. So we're incredibly grateful. And listeners, I want to remind you that you can learn more about and support the important work that Wilderness Watch is doing across our country at their website. So be sure to give them a visit, sign up for all of the action alerts that may matter to you. George, anything else you'd like to say before we go?
I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it. And thank you especially for all the great work Wild Cumberland does in protecting this incredible place. And we look forward to working with your organization and everybody out there who wants to help protect this place.
Thanks so much. We know how valuable your time is, so thanks for choosing to spend some of it with us today, everybody. Stay wild.
The Wild Cumberland podcast is produced by Vertical River, and this episode was edited by Greg Cuson.